Hi guys, this is the second part of Chapter 2 from The Beginner's Guide to Jungian Psychology. The totality of memory, what Freud termed simply the unconscious, Jung called the personal unconscious to distinguish it from the collective unconscious. The personal unconscious is significant enough in itself. It seems to have available every experience of our lives, whether or not these experiences ever passed into consciousness. For example, at this moment I'm typing words on a word processor. I'm conscious of the words on the monitor in front of me. Usually when I'm writing, that is virtually all that I'm conscious of. I don't hear the drone of the fan in my computer, which is quite loud. I don't hear the softer purr of the air conditioner in the background. I'm not aware of the way my body feels in the chair I'm sitting in, until I sit so long that I realize I ache all over. I don't see the books to the right and left of the monitor, or the wall of books behind it. In short, I'm not conscious of most of the sensations with which I'm constantly bombarded, yet all of the other sensations, sight, sound, smell, temperature, changes on my skin, are noticed by my body, and seemingly virtually all of them are somehow recorded. Psychologist hypnotherapist Ernest Lawrence Rossi has summarized a wide variety of research that argues persuasively that our memories are state dependent. That is, we don't remember isolated little bits of information. We remember the entire environment in which an event took place. Because of this fact, it's very difficult to remember an event in a totally different physical environment. However, if we return the body and mind to a state similar to the state they were in when an event first took place, we can usually re-experience that event as if it were taking place right now. Roland Fisher, professor of experimental psychology at Ohio State University College of Medicine, cited as an example the millionaire in the Charlie Chaplin movie City Lights. Drunk, the millionaire adored the little tramp who had saved his life. Sober, he couldn't remember him. How we managed to record all that information is another question. In the 1940s, neurophysiologist Carl Lashley searched in vain for engrams, localized memory sites. Lashley would train rats to learn some new trick, then destroy parts of their brains, under the theory that when he destroyed the part where the memory was stored, the rat would no longer be able to perform the trick. Instead, no matter what part of their brains he destroyed, the rats could still perform the tricks. In fact, he was able to destroy up to 80% of the brain without stopping the rat's ability to perform their trick. His colleague, Carl Pilgrim, hit upon a possible answer some years later. He argued that much of our memory is recorded across the entire brain in an analogous manner to the way a hologram records a three-dimensional image across an entire piece of film. Brigham argued that our memories of events are similarly spread over our brain, and that the brain records the total event, that is, the entire complex of sensations that we experience at any one time. I don't mean to deny that the brain specializes. There are definitely locations in the cerebral cortex that specialize in seeing other parts, in hearing, etc. But if the seeing parts are destroyed, the memory of how to see still remains. Other parts of the brain take over the tasks formerly performed by the specialists. They may not be as good at first, but they get better over time. As a new specialist develops, it's reminiscent of the way you can cut off the tail of a chameleon, and it will regenerate a new one. We are able to do this because we are not recording individual sights and sounds. Instead, we are recording the totality of the moment. Seemingly all of the brain mean that other parts of the brain haven't also recorded the event, including the visual elements of the event. And of course, terming something an event is just a deviation of time. We still don't understand this process very thoroughly, though neurophysiology is a rapidly developing field. It's possible that my comments are a slight overstatement of the situation, but they are certainly closer to the real situation than any of the descriptions of memory we learned in school. Several psychologists have tried to measure the difference between intentional recall and recognition. In one experiment, subjects were presented with a list of 100 words 5 times. When asked to recall the list, they scored about 30%. When, on the other hand, the subjects were asked to recognize the 100 words mixed with 100 unrelated words, they scored 96% correct. This still leaves open the possibility that under more suitable experimental conditions, they would have recognized even more, perhaps even 100%. It was also seen that visual memory is considerably superior to verbal memory. On tests of 10,000 picture subjects, recognized 99.6% of them correctly. As one researcher commented, the recognition of pictures is essentially perfect. As we will see many times in the pages to follow, the mind seemingly cannot be limited to the brain. It's highly unlikely that the collective unconscious is somehow stored in every individual brain. It's much more likely that the brain is in large part a communication device rather than a storage device. The brain seen as a TV set. In this light, biologist Rupert Sheldrake gives a wonderful analogy between memories in the brain and programs in the television set. Imagine you are watching a TV show for the first time with no idea of what a television was. At the most primitive level, you might think that there were actually little people in the set. As you examine the set, you would quickly discard that overly simple explanation. You would notice that there was a great deal of equipment inside the set. Raised as we are on the wonders of science, you would probably decide that the equipment inside the set created the picture and sound. As you turned the knob and got different pictures and sounds, you would probably become more convinced of your argument. If you took a tube out of the set and the picture died, you would probably feel that you had convincingly demonstrated your case. Suppose that someone told you what actually happened, that the sounds and pictures were coming from a distant location, carried on invisible waves that could somehow be created at the distant location, be received by your TV set, and transformed into pictures and sounds. You'd probably find such an explanation to be ridiculous. At the very least, it would seem to disobey Occam's razor. That is, it is much simpler to have the pictures and sound created by the TV set than to imagine invisible waves. However, you might be willing to come around if you were told several other things about TV sets. First, you might be told that millions of other people have TV sets just like yours, and each of their sets could all do all the things yours could. You'd find that fascinating, but it wouldn't shake your argument. After all, each of those sets would undoubtedly be manufactured to produce these wonderful pictures and sounds. However, how could you explain that each of the million sets could get the same program at the same time? The capper to that might come if the channel of your set was turned to a news program where a reporter told you about an event that was happening as he or she spoke. If you then found out that every one of the million sets was able to see and classroom while the teacher pointed to the individual letters, then said them out loud. You and your classmates repeated the letters over and over with a monotonous repetition that only the very young can endure. Then you carefully copied each of the letters in your notebook. You copied the letters over and over until you knew exactly what an A looked like and how it differed from a B and a C and so forth. Then you learned how the letters combined to make words. You slowly sounded out each letter of an unknown word until you could pronounce the whole word. If you already knew the word, your task was done. If you didn't, then you had to find out what the word meant. As you got better at reading, you could instantly recognize whole words at a glance, so that you didn't have to go through them letter by letter in order to spell out a word. For most of us, that speedy recognition made reading a joy instead of a chore. We became readers. For some, that speedy recognition never came. In any case, for all of us, it took a great deal of time and effort to learn how to read. Once the ability to read was acquired, you probably spent a great deal of time using that ability. I've never seen any statistics that I would imagine that highly literate people might spend half their waking hours reading one thing or another. But how much of that reading time is conscious? I'd venture to say very little. For fast readers, the words flow by without any conscious awareness of their passage. The words flow straight from the book to the unconscious without any conscious intervention. I have purposefully picked a controversial example to make my point. You might argue that you are conscious when you are reading, but it is a low level of consciousness most of the time. I would have a difficult time disagreeing with you, but how about driving a car? Like learning to read, it took a good deal of time and effort to learn how to drive for most of us in the Western world. It's a critical skill. We must drive. If we make mistakes while driving, we can kill ourselves and others. Yet how much conscious attention do we pay to driving most of the time? When I'm driving a route I know well, I turn my consciousness to a myriad of other things, confident that some other part of the mind will take care of the driving. Have you ever driven past the exit you wanted to on the freeway, or taken the old route the day that you had to go someplace different? How could you do that if you were conscious of driving, if you weren't conscious of what was going on during your driving? So, are we conscious when we read or drive or not? Clearly, the relationship between consciousness and the unconscious forms a complex dynamic that doesn't easily yield an answer. Archetype and complex. It was this dynamic relationship between conscious and unconscious that Jung observed and described while working as a young doctor at the Bergolozzi Mental Clinic in Switzerland. Jung conducted some word association experiments where he recorded the patient's response to a stimulus word and also measured the reaction time of the response. When he analyzed the results, he found that the responses with the longest reaction times tended to cluster around subjects that had emotional significance for the patient. For example, if the patient had difficulty in dealing with a father, the responses that came the slowest would turn out to have some association for the patient with the father. That doesn't mean that the stimulus words had to be directly connected to the concept of father. They just had to be connected with the father in the patient's mind. In our example, most people would associate the word milk with the mother rather than the father. However, if the patient had once spilled milk and been reproached by the father, milk might be such a stimulus word. Jung termed these clusters of emotionally loaded concepts complexes. As I mentioned earlier, this concept of a complex appealed to Freud, as was one of the early reasons for his interest in Jung. Freud theorized that all complexes revolved around sexually significant events from early life. He reasoned that the process of psychoanalysis should be able to bring the personal associations to mind one at a time. Eventually, the chain of associations would lead back to a sexually charged event from childhood. Once the patient uncovered the primal event that lay at the root of the complex, there would be nothing left in the complex and the patient would be cured. The This is a logical, tidy theory that unfortunately doesn't match the facts. When Jung explored his patient's complexes, he found something quite different. The patient didn't automatically get well when all of the personal associations had been brought to light, nor was there always or even frequently a primal event at the core of the complex. Instead, Jung found that after everything personal was made conscious, there still remained a core of incredible emotional power. Instead of diffusing the energy increased. What could form such a core? Why did it have such energy? It seemed that there must be an impersonal nucleus within a complex. In the discussion of Paul MacLean's concept of the triune brain, we see that our brains contain evolutionary history within their very structure, and that ancient structure still controls much of the life we think, that we live so consciously. In order to do so, those structures must be highly organized so that they can be accessed as needed. If our evolutionary past is stored within us, or at least available for us to access, as if it were stored within us, there are only two ways that can appear in our lives through behavioral actions in the outer world. That is what we normally termed instinct, and through images in our inner world, which Jung initially termed primordial images and later archetypes from the Greek word for prime imprinter. There is good reason for supposing that the archetypes are the unconscious images of the instincts themselves. In other words, that they are patterns of instinctual behaviors. The hypothesis of the collective unconscious is, therefore, no more daring than to assume there are instincts. The question is simply this: are there or are there not unconscious universal forms of this kind? If they exist, then there is a region of the psyche which one can call the collective unconscious. As we can see from Jung's comments, he came to use the term archetype to mean a formless pattern that underlay both instinctual behaviors and primordial images. For example, at the core of a father complex is a father archetype. For a particular patient, the father archetype gathers about itself images and behaviors of the father that are available from the patient's experience. As one digs deeper into the complex, the images and behaviors found tend to be less personal and more rooted in the experience of the patient's cultural heritage. Whether or not the patient has any personal knowledge of the image or behavior. Unfortunately, a wonderful word like archetype seems far too philosophic and literary for modern scientists. It brings up images of Plato's ideal images and other such taboo subjects. Of course, Jung chose the word archetype for just such a reason, realizing that long before science, our greatest thinkers were able to peer beneath the cover of physical reality. I would like to substitute still another term for archetype, cognitive invariant, a somewhat ungainly term that might be more welcome and intelligible to modern science. Cognition is the mental process of knowing or perceiving. Invariant means constant, hence those constants which in part determine our knowledge of reality. There is currently a flurry of research cutting across a wide variety of science, which gathers itself under the general term cognitive science. Howard Gardner, in his book The Mind's New Science, describes cognitive science as a contemporary empirically based effort to answer long-standing epistemological questions, particularly those concerned with the nature of knowledge, its components, its sources, its development, and its deployment. Archetypes, or cognitive invariants, fit into any such study, since if they exist, they are definitely components of knowledge, sources of knowledge, and heavily involved in the development and deployment of our knowledge of reality. Accordingly, throughout this book, I will occasionally use cognitive invariant interchangeably with archetype. When discussing archetypes in general, I will usually use archetype when referring to a particular archetype. My favorite example of an archetype, in this case a mother archetype, concerns the late distinguished ethologist Conrad Lorenz and a baby goose who thought Lorenz was its mother. Lorenz won the Nobel Prize in large part for his discovery of the way instinctual behavior is triggered in animals. He found that animals, including men and women of course, are born with inner predispositions towards certain highly specific behaviors. In particular, instinctual behavior may lie quiescent in the animal for years until the time arrives when it is needed. When that time arrives, this inborn collective behavior is triggered by specific outer stimuli. Lorenz termed this process imprinting. Remember that archetype derives from the Greek for prime imprinter. Now, in effect, Lorenz was resurrecting the scientifically unfashionable theory of instincts, but he provided a new piece to the puzzle. By careful observation of how imprinting occurred, he was able to provide the details of how such instinctual behaviors actually operate. For example, while studying the behavior of geese, Lorenz just happened to be present when a baby goose was hatched. The baby imprinted the mother archetype onto Lorenz, that is, the baby goose decided that Lorenz was its mother. King Solomon's ring contained a marvelous picture of Lorenz walking along deep in thought with a baby goose waddling behind, as baby geese have always waddled along behind their mothers. Now Lorenz doesn't look anything like a goose, nor does he talk like a goose, act like a goose, etc. Therefore, the mother archetype certainly can't be stored inside the goose as a picture of what a mother goose should look like. The archetype has to be flexible enough to adapt to a personal experience of mother as different from a normal mother goose, as Conrad Lorenz happens to be. That's what Jung meant by insisting that archetypes were formless. Jung encountered archetypes from the outside in through his study of their complexes. However, as we've seen with the baby goose, it is clearly the archetype which comes first. Imagine a human baby instead of our baby goose. It must contain a mother archetype that it imprints onto its own mother. That archetype seemingly contains the entire human history of the interaction of mother and child, and probably the entire animal history as well. A relationship that has been so important for so long gathers energy which shapes the newborn baby's relationship with its physical mother. Each baby is unique and each mother is unique. Therefore, each baby has to graft its individual relationship with its mother onto the collective archetype of the mother. For example, at birth, the baby already knows how to suckle, as every bottle-fed baby knows. That behavior is certainly able to adapt to a bottle instead of a breast. Every baby knows how to cry and how to smile. We've all heard the argument that what we term smiling is only a reaction to gas. However, more recent research serves to indicate that a baby smiles as an attraction for its parents. If a baby cries and finds the mother instantly there to see what the problem is, it will grow up with a different adaptation to life than a baby whose mother ignores the crying and keeps to a set schedule of times for sleeping and feeding. Over the course of the years it takes the development from infant to adult, each of us acquires a vast number of memories of his or her particular mother. These memories cluster around the archetype of the mother to form a complex of associations to mother. Essentially, we have formed a mother within who has both universal characteristics and characteristics specific to our own particular mother. When we have to deal with situations similar to those we encounter with our mother, we draw on the mother complex. For example, when a baby girl develops into a 3-year-old child and starts to do something she knows is bad, she might say out loud, "Bad girl." That is the internalized mother at work. If she falls down and scrapes her knee, she will run off to her mother for comfort. If the mother is not available, she will probably hug herself, as if she was being hugged by her mother. When our baby girl finally grows up to be an adult, she will keep drawing on the mother complex in appropriate situations. If her relationship with her mother has been healthy, she will be able to draw comfort and nourishment when needed from her inner mother. If her relationship with her mother has been unhealthy, she is likely to have difficulty trusting anyone because she will see any nurturing situation through the lens of her own sad experiences. Remember that recent years, psychologists have begun to study children with terrible family backgrounds who somehow managed to become healthy and successful, frequently termed super kids. These children turned to other adults for the love and support they didn't get from their parents. Sometimes they managed to find an adult or a special teacher who can become a substitute mother or father. More frequently, they managed to assemble a mother and father they need out of the characteristics of a number of adults. That's really quite amazing, and only explainable if these children already have some inner template of the mother and the father that they can match to their experiences in outer life. Archetypes of development. There is no way to decide how many archetypes there are. There are seemingly archetypes for every person, place, object, or situation, which has had emotional power for a large number of people over a large period of time. If there are such a large number of archetypes, they must have hierarchical levels. That is, the archetype of mother must be contained within the archetype of the feminine. But the archetype of the feminine must also contain the archetype of the wife, sister, and lover, etc. The archetypes of mother, wife, sister, and lover would overlap at the point where each was part of the feminine, but the archetype of the mother would also overlap with the archetype of the father at the point where each was part of the archetype of parent. In other words, by necessity, archetypes do not have clear boundaries. Each archetype merges into other archetypes at that boundary. There is exactly the same situation we encounter within our experience of the physical world. Ducks and chickens and ostriches are all birds. Birds and mammals are vertebrates, etc. Some classification system is necessary and useful, but the world itself doesn't fall into categories. We humans impose the categories in order to deal with the complexity of the world. Archetypes are equally beyond categorization, yet categories are equally useful for humans. Jung could have devoted the rest of his life to collecting and categorizing archetypes, like some early botanist of the psyche, but Jung came to this discovery of the archetypes of the collective unconscious because he was trying to heal patients. Consequently, he was most interested in discovering the archetypes that underlay the process of inner healing and growth, which he called individuation. Accordingly, from the multiplicity of archetypes that we encounter, either in our dreams or projected onto the world, Jung singled out 3 for special attention, since he felt they represented sequentially the stages of the individuation process. The shadow, the archetype that personifies all those personal traits which we have been ignored or denied, usually represented by a figure of the same sex as the dreamer. The animus, the archetype that serves as the connection to the impersonal collective unconscious, usually represented by a figure of the opposite sex to the dreamer. The self, the archetype of wholeness and transcendence, sometimes represented by the wise old man or wise old woman, but which takes a wide variety of human, animal, and abstract forms. Elsewhere, I've termed these 3 the archetypes of development, since each corresponds to a distinct stage of psychological development. Each is encountered one level deeper in the psyche. We'll discuss each of these stages at some length in later chapters, however. First, we will explore a topic that fascinates all of us, dreams. So, next time we will read chapter 3 of A Beginner's Guide to Jungian Psychology. Okay guys, have a nice day.